Welcome friends! In this video I'm installing a Mishimoto dual catch can system to replace the IAG Air-Oil Separator that I sold earlier this year. First thing I needed to do was pop the hood and remove my AFE intake using an 8mm socket. I unplugged the sensor connected on the inside of the tubing and pulled the intake out. Then I used a 10mm socket and ratchet to remove the two nuts holding on the engine cover, and I pulled that out. The last thing I needed to do to prep was to pull out the CCV hose running from bank 2 on the driver's side to the driver's side turbo inlet. I unplugged the sensor first by pulling that little lock out and then pressing and pulling off the connector. Then I just used my thumb to rotate the tab and unlock the CCV hose connectors. These were super tight the first time that I removed the hose, and sometimes it requires downward pressure to release the lock. Behold the unboxing. Paper, some hoses wrapped in plastic, and some boxes. The large box holds the PCV can, the smaller box holds the CCV can, both with drain plugs on the bottom. There's also a very nice powder-coated mount, which is super heavy duty. Inside the plastic, the hoses were separated into long hoses for the PCV and the shorter, chalky hoses for the CCV. Inside the cans looked very normal with large vapor collectors and mesh filters. For some reason, the PCV can has an O-ring that seals externally, while the CCV can seals internally. So here comes the awful part of the installation process for me, which was destroying the CCV hose to remove the sensor and sensor tube. I used a pick to pull out the sensor first so I wouldn't damage it with the heat gun. Then I heated up the hose until I could pull off the plastic sensor tube. I did the valve cover side first and immediately noticed that the sensor tube was female and male instead of male and male, like in the Mishimoto instructions. That meant that the entire Mishimoto hose design just wouldn't work. I had spent hours cleaning my intercooler and all the charged air hosing, so I wasn't going to give up at this point. So I ran to Orielly Auto Parts and bought a 5/8 inch male-to-male heater hose connector. I heated up the female side of the sensor tube and shoved the Orielly connector in as far as I could get it. I was pretty sure that the sensor tube sealed up on the connector with heat, but I added a hose clamp just in case. I added the turbo inlet side hose next, and then noted the extra space that the new Orielly connector made. I ended up grabbing some large gauge wire cutters and cut about 1 inch off the can outlet side of the tube. I should have done the same on the other side, on the turbo inlet side, but I was worried about the sensor wire length, so I just left it be. I plugged in the sensor with the connector pointed down toward the turbo inlet and moved on to installing the can hose barbs. I oiled up the gaskets a bit and then tightened them down using a 20mm socket, which is a very weird size. On the truck, I removed the PCV hose on the passenger side by twisting the tabs, and then I installed the large can's hoses. These are pretty easy to identify by the length and the direction of the connectors. Then I installed the CCV hoses and started connecting the PCV hoses to the large can. The hose clamp orientation is really important here because the can is recessed into the mount and the clamps need to be out of the way. On the firewall, I used a 15mm deep socket to remove the engine ground nut, popped off the engine grounding strap tether, and unscrewed the insulator retaining washer. Then I installed the large Mishimoto can into the mount using a 3mm Allen key. I wish that this could be done after installing the mount, but one of the bolts is under the hood cowl. So I'm going to pause here. This grounding strap stud needs to be tightened into the firewall before putting the grounding strap on. Since the strap has these little wings to keep it oriented properly, then the mount goes on over the ground and the same nut is used to secure it. Then I added the special directional washer over the other stud and installed the supplied nut. The hardest part is tightening down the ground nut using a 15mm wrench. It's difficult to tell whether or not it's tight, and if the grounding strap isn't oriented properly, then the nut might feel tight even though the mount isn't fully seated along with the ground. But with both nuts tight, I installed the small can onto the mount using a 2.5mm Allen key and threw the hoses on, tightening down the hose clamps. To avoid rubbing and allow the engine cover to go back on and fit properly, I did some zip tying and installed the intake before finally starting the truck. I ended up with several codes, which I had to clear several times until I finally figured out that the ground wasn't seated all the way, like I had mentioned earlier, so I had to take the mount back off, tighten up the stud, put the ground back on properly, and make sure that the ground nut was very tight. And I was good to go. Alright, so overall I really like the catch cans. The sensor tube was a giant nightmare, but I'm not sure how many people have that different part that I have. I feel like I'm going to get a lot of questions on whether or not the tube was actually male, and I just didn't know what I was looking at. But trust me, I quadruple checked. It was female on one side and male on the other side, and it was a solid piece that held that sensor in. I was still able to make it work though, but since I didn't cut the lower hose, it seems to be flattening out a bit, and I should have just cut both sides. When I started the truck and I got a bunch of codes, I was nervous because I did several things at the same time while installing this, but after Googling the codes, I saw some threads referring to the ground strap, and I knew something was wrong there. I think it would be better to use a thin nut to tighten down the ground strap and then throw the bracket over top of that. It's just wild that the mount not being tight enough would cause such a serious problem. These cans do need to be drained, which isn't a big deal if you do your own maintenance, but it could always just be forgotten, and you could end up filling up the whole can, I guess, although the cans are enormous. You could make it a little bit easier by putting a Mishimoto valve on the bottom of the can, since there are those drain plugs. But that seems dumb because it's just as easy to unscrew the can and drain it that way. Ultimately, I do think that a catch can is a necessary item on these vehicles with how much oil gets pushed out of the crankcase. I do wish that I would have done this sooner, and I'm still very happy with the catch cans. Anywho, that's all I've got. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.